Chapter 1. Breaking Point. Louise Henley grew up in a weathered, low-income neighborhood on the fringes of Daytona Beach, Florida, where the salty air from the nearby ocean mingled with the grit of a working-class existence. His childhood home, a modest single-story house with peeling paint and a sagging porch, sat among rows of similar structures, each bearing the wear of coastal humidity and economic struggle. Luis, a lanky teenager with a quiet demeanor, spent much of his youth navigating the expectations of a community where toughness was currency and ambition was often met with skepticism. His father, Charles Henley, cast a long shadow over Luis's life. A former Marine who had served in the Gulf War, Charles carried the rigid discipline of his military background into his civilian role as head of security for a sprawling manufacturing corporation based in Central Florida. His broad shoulders and stern gaze commanded respect, but his parenting was defined by an unyielding hardness. Charles viewed the world through a lens of strength and survival, measuring worth by physical resilience and practical skills. To him, Luis's fascination with computers, mathematics, and abstract ideas like coding was not just impractical, but a sign of weakness. He dismissed his son's dreams of pursuing a degree in technology as fanciful, a betrayal of the grit he believed defined a man. Charles's criticism was relentless, his words cutting into Luis's confidence, framing his aspirations as childish whims unfit for the real world. In the summer of 2005, as Luis turned 18, a pivotal moment arrived. He received a letter from the University of Georgia informing him of a full academic scholarship to study computer science. The news, which filled Luis with a rare sense of hope, was a lifeline to a future he had only dared to imagine. He had spent countless nights teaching himself basic programming on an outdated desktop computer he had salvaged from a thrift store, its fan whirring loudly as he pored over library books on algorithms and software design. The scholarship was validation of his quiet determination, a chance to escape the confines of Daytona Beach and his father's disapproval. Charles, however, saw the scholarship as an affront. When Luis shared the news, expecting even a flicker of pride, his father's reaction was cold and final. He declared that he would not contribute a single dollar to what he called a fool's errand. To Charles, real men worked with their hands or enforced order, not sat behind screens chasing intangible ideas. The argument that followed was not a discussion but a verdict. Charles's voice, steady and unyielding, filled the small living room as he laid down his ultimatum. Luis was to abandon his plans or leave the house for good. He saw his son's pursuit of education as a rejection of everything he stood for, a defiance he could not tolerate. With a final pronouncement that Luis should not return until he had proven himself a real man, Charles turned away, leaving no room for reconciliation. Luis packed a single duffel bag that night, his hands trembling as he folded clothes and tucked away his few possessions. A notebook filled with handwritten code, a worn copy of a programming textbook, and a photo of his late mother, whose quiet encouragement had once been his anchor. The weight of his father's words pressed heavily on him, but so did a flicker of resolve. As he stepped out into the humid Florida night, the sound of the door closing behind him echoed like a final severance. With the scholarship as his only certainty, Luis left Daytona Beach, carrying both the sting of rejection and the faint hope of proving his worth on his own terms. Chapter 2. Under Another Name. Luis Henley left Daytona Beach behind, carrying little more than a duffel bag and a scholarship letter as he boarded a Greyhound bus bound for Atlanta. The decision to change his surname to Lowell was not impulsive. It was a deliberate act of reinvention, a way to sever ties with the weight of his father's expectations and the pain of rejection. In the sprawling, humid city of Atlanta, Luis found a fresh canvas, one where he could redefine himself on his own terms. He settled into a cramped, shared apartment near the University of Georgia's satellite campus, its walls thin and the air thick with the scent of takeout from nearby restaurants. The city's energy, a blend of ambition and grit, suited his determination to carve out a new path. Enrolled in the computer science program, Luis threw himself into his studies with a quiet intensity. His days were a blur of lectures on algorithms, data structures, and mathematical analytics, subjects that felt like a language he was born to speak. To support himself, he took on grueling night shifts at a local supermarket, mopping floors and restocking shelves under flickering fluorescent lights. The work was monotonous, the hours long, but it paid for his textbooks and the occasional meal beyond instant noodles. Sleep became a luxury, often limited to a few hours snatched between shifts and classes. Yet Luis found solace in the rhythm of his new life. The exhaustion was a badge of his independence, proof that he could survive without his father's approval. In his second year, Luis's talent began to surface in a tangible way. During a late-night study session in the university's computer lab, surrounded by the hum of outdated PCs, he developed a prototype algorithm designed to optimize routes for freight trucking. The idea had sparked from a case study in one of his courses, which detailed inefficiencies in logistics networks across the Southeast. Luis saw patterns where others saw chaos, and his algorithm, though rudimentary, reduced delivery times and fuel costs in simulated models. He refined it over weeks, testing it against real-world data scraped from public shipping records, his fingers flying across the keyboard as lines of code took shape. The prototype was far from perfect, but its potential was undeniable. Word of his project reached a logistics firm based in Raleigh, North Carolina, after Luis presented it at a regional tech symposium. The company, struggling with rising fuel costs and delivery delays, saw promise in his work and offered a small grant to further develop the algorithm. Sensing an opportunity, Luis teamed up with two classmates, a brash marketing major named Tara and a meticulous finance student named Raj, who shared his vision of turning the prototype into something bigger. Together, they founded Cargofly, a startup aimed at revolutionizing freight logistics through data-driven solutions. From the outset, Luis insisted on keeping his personal identity in the shadows. The company's legal documents, filed through a network of advisors, listed him only as L. Lowell, a decision born of his desire to build something that stood apart from his past. Cargofly's early days were lean, operating out of a shared dorm room with mismatched furniture and a single whiteboard covered in flowcharts. Yet, as the algorithm improved and small contracts trickled in, Luis felt the first stirrings of a future he had built himself, one line of code at a time. Chapter 3. The Network. 8 years had passed since Luis Lowell, once Luis Henley, had left Daytona Beach and forged a new identity in Atlanta. In that time, Cargofly had transformed from a dorm room startup into a formidable player in the logistics industry, particularly across the southern United States. The company's algorithm, once a rough prototype, had evolved into a sophisticated suite of tools that optimized freight routes, reduced operational costs, and streamlined supply chains for clients ranging from regional distributors to national retailers. Headquartered in a sleek, glass-walled office in downtown Atlanta, Cargofly had become a name synonymous with efficiency. Its logo, a stylized arrow weaving through a grid, emblazoned on trucks and shipping manifests across the Southeast. Under Luis's leadership as CEO of the newly formed Elway Lowell Group, the parent company of Cargofly, the business expanded aggressively. Luis orchestrated the acquisition of smaller regional logistics firms, each struggling to compete in an industry increasingly driven by data and automation. These acquisitions were strategic, folding local expertise and infrastructure into a growing corporate network that operated with the precision of a well-tuned machine. Warehouses in Alabama, delivery hubs in South Carolina, and dispatch centers in Georgia all fell under the L. Lowell Group's umbrella, their operations integrated into the company's proprietary software. The network's reach extended to Jacksonville, Florida, where a modest but profitable trucking firm was absorbed, its office repurposed as a regional hub. Luis oversaw these moves with a meticulous hand, his days spent analyzing data, refining algorithms, and negotiating contracts, all while maintaining a low profile. He avoided media interviews and public appearances, letting his co-founders, Tara and Raj, handle the company's public face. His name, L. Lowell, appeared only in fine print on corporate documents, a ghost in the machine he had built. In Jacksonville, the newly acquired branch operated like any other, its employees unaware of the larger corporate machinery behind it. Among them was Charles Henley, Luis's father, who had recently joined the firm as a senior security consultant. After a bitter layoff from his previous job at a manufacturing plant, Charles had sought work that aligned with his experience as a former Marine and security chief. The Jacksonville branch, with its steady contracts and modern facilities, seemed a fitting place to lend his expertise. At 62, his hair now fully gray and his frame slightly stooped, Charles carried himself with the same authoritative air that had defined him in Luis's childhood. He reviewed security protocols, trained staff on emergency procedures, and conducted risk assessments, his military precision evident in every task. The job offered stability, a necessity after years of financial strain, and he took pride in his role, unaware that the company's ultimate decision-maker was the son he had once dismissed. Luis, from his office in Atlanta, signed off on countless documents, including the employment contract that brought Charles into the fold. The irony was not lost on him, though he kept it buried beneath layers of focus on the company's growth. The Jacksonville branch, like all others, reported to the L. Lowell Group's centralized system, its operations tracked through dashboards that Luis monitored daily. Charles's name appeared as just another entry in the employee database, a detail among thousands, unlinked to the personal history that still lingered in Luis's memory. The corporate network, vast and impersonal, had inadvertently drawn father and son into the same orbit, their paths converging without either realizing the other's presence. Chapter 4. On the Front Line. In the spring of 2019, Cargofly announced its annual Employee Summit, a grand gathering held at a sprawling convention center in Orlando, Florida. The event was a showcase of the company's growth, a chance for employees from every corner of its expanding network to converge, share ideas, and celebrate milestones. The Orlando venue, with its polished marble floors and towering glass atrium, buzzed with activity as delegates from regional branches arrived, their company badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. Among them was a delegation from the Jacksonville branch, a small but proud group representing the firm's foothold in Florida's logistics hub. Charles Henley, at 66, was the oldest member of the group, a senior security consultant whose presence carried the weight of his decades of experience. Charles arrived at the summit with the same commanding demeanor that had defined his career. His hair, now fully silver, was neatly combed, and his posture, though slightly softened by age, retained the rigid discipline of his Marine days. Dressed in a crisp navy blazer and a Cargofly-branded polo, he moved through the convention center with purpose, shaking hands and exchanging nods with younger colleagues. As the representative for security, he was tasked with leading a panel discussion on risk management, a role he embraced with confidence. The summit's agenda was packed with workshops, keynote speeches, and networking sessions, but Charles gravitated toward the more practical discussions, where he could share his hard-earned knowledge. During his panel, he spoke at length about the importance of discipline and structure, drawing on anecdotes from his military service to illustrate his points. His voice, gravelly but steady, carried an air of authority that captivated the room, though some younger attendees shifted uncomfortably when he dismissed modern data-driven approaches as overly reliant on office programmers who lacked real-world grit. Between sessions, Charles held court in the convention center's sprawling lounge areas, where employees gathered over coffee and branded swag. His stories, told with a mix of pride and bitterness, often turned to personal matters. He spoke of his son, a boy he described as having abandoned the family's values for a life of vague, unmanly pursuits. To Charles, his son's departure years earlier was a betrayal, a rejection of the toughness and pragmatism he had tried to instill. He recounted the story to anyone who would listen, painting his son as a faceless disappointment, someone who had faded into obscurity rather than rise to meet his father's expectations. The irony hung heavy, unnoticed by Charles, that the very systems he criticized, those built on algorithms and analytics, were the backbone of the company hosting the summit. The summit unfolded over 3 days, a whirlwind of presentations and breakout sessions that highlighted Cargofly's technological advancements. Charles, oblivious to the deeper currents of the company's origins, remained a vocal presence, his confidence unshaken. He navigated the event as a seasoned veteran, unaware that the ecosystem he now served had been created by the very person he believed had failed him. The convention center, with its banners proclaiming Cargofly's mission of efficiency and innovation, stood as a testament to a vision Charles could not comprehend, its roots tied to a past he had long dismissed. Chapter 5. The Name. On the final day of Cargafly's annual summit in Orlando, the convention center's main hall filled with anticipation. The closing keynote was the event's centerpiece, a moment for the company's leadership to outline its vision for the future. Rows of employees dressed in branded polos and lanyards settled into their seats, their murmurs fading as the lights dimmed. The stage, flanked by large screens displaying the company's logo, stood empty for a moment before the announcer introduced the CEO, Leonard Lowell. A ripple of curiosity passed through the crowd, as few had ever seen the elusive figure behind the L. Lowell Group in person. Louise, now Leonard Lowell, stepped into the spotlight with a composed presence. At 32, he bore little resemblance to the lanky teenager who had left Daytona Beach years earlier. A neatly trimmed beard framed his jaw, and wire-rimmed glasses gave him a scholarly air. His tailored charcoal suit, understated yet sharp, contrasted with the casual attire of the summit's attendees. He carried himself with quiet confidence, his movements deliberate as he approached the podium. The hall, packed with hundreds of employees from across the company's network, fell silent, all eyes fixed on the man who had built their enterprise from a dorm room dream into a regional powerhouse. Luis began his speech with a measured tone, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. He spoke of his journey, starting with a moment that had defined him, being told he would never amount to a man. The words hung in the air, their weight palpable to the audience, though only one person in the room understood their full significance. As he continued, Luis revealed that someone who had once cast him out was now part of the very company he had created. The large screens behind him flickered, and cameras panned across the audience, settling on Charles Henley, seated near the back. Charles, his face weathered and his posture rigid, remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the stage. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension unspoken but electric. Luis's speech shifted to lessons learned from hardship. He described the value of resilience, of proving one's worth in the face of doubt, even to those who failed to recognize you. His words were not vengeful, but reflective, acknowledging the harsh lesson that had fueled his ambition. No one was obligated to believe in you. It was your responsibility to prove your worth. The audience listened intently, some nodding, others scribbling notes, unaware of the personal history unfolding before them. For Luis, the moment was not about confrontation, but clarity, a public claiming of his identity, no longer hidden behind the initials L. Lowell. As he concluded, the hall erupted in applause, the sound washing over him as he stepped back from the podium, his gaze steady but distant, fixed on a point beyond the crowd. Charles remained seated, his expression unreadable. The cameras lingered on him briefly before returning to the stage, capturing the contrast between the CEO's composed resolve and the older man's stillness. For Luis, the speech marked a turning point, a moment where he stood fully in his own name, not as a reaction to the past, but as a declaration of what he had built. The summit continued with closing remarks and a final round of applause, but the weight of that moment lingered, a silent acknowledgement of a divide crossed, if not bridged. Chapter 6. The Response. A week after the Orlando summit, a single envelope arrived at the L. Lowell Group's Atlanta headquarters, addressed to Leonard Lowell. The letter, written in a steady but slightly uneven hand, came from Charles Henley, postmarked from Jacksonville. Inside was a brief message, its tone neither apologetic nor conciliatory, but offering a tentative openness to listen if Luis ever chose to speak. The words, sparse and unadorned, reflected the stubborn pride of a man who had spent decades defining the world on his own terms. Charles acknowledged no fault, claiming age had fixed his perspective, yet the letter itself was a gesture, however restrained, toward a connection long severed. Luis received the letter in his office, a sleek space overlooking Atlanta's skyline, its walls lined with charts and awards that mark Cargafly's rise. He opened the envelope at his desk, a polished mahogany surface cluttered with reports and a laptop displaying real-time logistics data. As he read the note, his expression remained unreadable, his fingers tracing the edge of the paper. The message stirred no immediate reaction, no rush of anger or reconciliation. Instead, it settled into him like a stone, heavy but not disruptive. He placed the letter face up on the desk, its presence a quiet marker of a past he had long outgrown. Luis chose not to respond, not out of spite, but because the act of replying felt unnecessary. The letter, in its blunt honesty, gave him what he had sought, not an apology, but the acknowledgement that his truth had been heard. In the days that followed, Luis stepped more fully into the public eye. He began signing documents with his full name, Leonard Lowell, and accepted invitations to industry conferences where he spoke openly about his vision for logistics innovation. His name appeared in trade journals, on stock exchange reports, and in profiles that hailed him as a self-made leader in the Southeast's tech-driven economy. The anonymity he had once cultivated as L. Lowell gave way to a deliberate visibility, not to prove anything to his father, but to claim the identity he had built through years of quiet determination. The halls of convention centers, the pages of business magazines, and the digital streams of industry news carried his name, a testament to his work and resolve. For the first time, Luis's success was not a reaction to the past, but a defiance of its constraints, a declaration of a life shaped on his own terms.